Into my talk, I would like to start with a little anecdote, which I think kind of encapsulates a lot of the problems that we'll be discussing today and the problems that underlie Turkish-Armenian relations. And this is a story from the year 2003. I was a bachelor student at the University in Sociology, and at some point I discovered online the truth about the genocide. I started reading books. I bought the book by Hakan Dadrian and Richard Hovhannisyan, and I started reading all of these books and educating myself. And this was a period in which I thought this is very important, and I want to specialize in this topic. And so it became 24 April, and so without knowing anybody, I went to attend a commemoration of the genocide. And that commemoration was in the small Dutch town of Assen. It's in the north of Holland, and there's one Armenian guy in the town, and he built a memorial to the genocide. And so gradually people started coming in. So I went there, and you can imagine I was kind of, you know, a bit of a beard, long black jacket, black shirt, you know, black backpack. Looks a bit weird, nobody knows me. So I went to the commemoration, and I stood all the way in the back of the room. Out of respect and modesty, you know, humble, we come to recognize the genocide. This is very important. And I stood there with my hands folded. And at some point there was, I felt two hands on my two elbows, and these two big men with leather jackets, they kind of dragged me into a room. And these were the two Armenian guys organizing the commemoration, and they asked me, "Who are you? And what do you come to do here?" And I said, "Stop, I can explain." And I opened my backpack, and I took out the books by Dadrian and Hovhannisyan and who know what. And then they were amazed. They were so happy. And one guy hugged me, the other one slapped my shoulder, and I said, "We love you." And then they put me from the back of the room all the way in the front on the VIP seat, and that was forever my seat there from then on. And now every year I get the invitation to speak at this very commemoration. Now, I'd like to talk today about boundaries. And in particular, I would like to distinguish the problems in our relationships between social boundaries and political boundaries. Let me start with the social boundaries. So I have basically two topics here. I think first of all, the genocide. We need to talk about that, no escaping it. And secondly, I'll talk a bit about how after the genocide our social relations changed and are changing. And then I'll move to political boundaries. I'll talk a bit about nationalism. There's a problem vexing our societies, and I'll talk about borders as a form of violence, maybe. So let me start with the genocide. I've written a lot and I've talked a lot about the genocide, so I won't go into the details of the genocide itself or what it meant, but I think I want to make one thing crystal clear from the beginning of my talk and the conference, namely, for me, the recognition of the genocide is an absolute priority. It is a responsibility of us, the Turks, and our state, the Turkish Republic, period. Just want to make that clear kind of as a ground base for the discussions. At the same time, I think that at least the minimum that the Turkish Republic should be doing is to fully discontinue the systematic state-led denial. And by that I mean end the denialist publications, change the school curricula, and take all of the denial off the foreign ministry. So I'm not even asking for recognition yet. Just stop the denial so we can have a free discussion in this country. Now, genocide is the denial of a collective existence of a group identity, a people. So it's purely categorical. It is nothing personal. And genocide has long-term emotional consequences. It pertains to the survivors, the individual survivors. It pertains to their direct relatives. It even pertains to the entire group. Now, what happens to these groups is, one argument made is that the groups suffer from trauma. So after the disaster, after the genocide, there's an indelible sense of a catastrophe. And the genocide affects group identity or group security, to be on the precise side. And there are basically two ways of looking at it. One is genetic, and the other model is genealogical. And that basically means the genetic approach argues that, well, certain things happen in history, and they automatically affect the contemporary relations, the present. That's one model in which there is victimization, and the victimization is a kind of victimization leads to the victim group feeling, insecure in their group identity. And this argument has been applied to three important victim communities of the great genocides in the 20th century: the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust in Israel, and the Rwandan genocide in Rwanda. Three countries populated by victimized communities, Armenians, Jews, and Tutsis. And so that's one model. But the other model is genealogical, the idea that we're living in the present and we basically grab into history elements that we need and justify our sense of identity or security. So the idea that we're living in the present thinking the genocide happened to us, it should never again happen to us, anything like this. And that leads to a sense of group security and identity. Now there are two points I want to make here. The first one is about victimization. We talk a lot about victimization. It's true, it's important. But we also need to move beyond victimization. Just like an individual victim who was robbed one evening isn't defined for the rest of his life as a victim forever, so too, we cannot allow the genocide to define our relationships forever. We're also dealing with survival, we're dealing with resilience, and we're even dealing with revival. The second point is about empathy. I think it is extremely important to develop a calm empathy and listen to the affected, reading their stories, reflecting on them. And this generally is not going too well, and we're dealing with rather heated emotions in our relations. I've seen this once. I was checking the, these message requests you get in Facebook. So these are people not in your friend list, but they message you. So I've written a lot, and then at some point I clicked on this message request to see who's been messaging me. And I got a long list of message requests. And the interesting thing was I looked at the names, and there was one Turkish person, one Armenian person, one Turkish person, one Armenian person. And I started reading these comments, and it was always the same. Armenians gave me compliments, the Turks gave me insults or threats. So we went from compliments and threats, compliments and threats. You know what? I'll read you some of these comments to get a sense of what this, how these relations are in the digital sphere. So in 2010, a Turkish man writes to me, "Hey man, what's up with this genocide nonsense? Do you really believe all those photos? And how do family photos even become genocide documents? I don't get it. Like, how do we even know these are not Turks massacred by Armenians? Apparently you're such a genius, but you look autistic to me. It's easy writing from Europe. Why don't you come to Turkey and write from here?" Okay, and obviously I don't respond to any of these things. Next message. Armenian man writes me, "Thank you, sir. I have been following some of your amazing accomplishments. You're a great man. Thank you. And again, thank you." So you go back and forth and back and forth. So I kind of don't know, am I doing something right or am I doing something wrong with this research? The second important topic in these changing social relations is how we develop as groups towards each other after this genocide. Now, the genocide was a form of extreme disempowerment of Armenians and social distancing between Turks and Armenians. And now, post-genocides, we are what I call intimate strangers. And this distancing has a kind of local cultural practice as well. In Armenian, you would say that we are kenning. In Turkish, you would say küsmek. In English, the translation is we are in the sulks. And these mutual perceptions are fairly new. So my family is originally from Yersinka or Erzincan, depending how you look at it. And there are lots of stories, local stories there from Armenians. So my own great-grandparents, they knew Armenians by name. They would point at a house in the village and say, this house belongs to Ohannes Efendi. Now that type of intimacy disappeared, and at least in the interior. And my generation has to meet Armenians across international borders. And this kind of saddens me. Now there are two processes that are important to mention here. The first, I think, is that we went from a triadic relationship to a dyadic relationship. Basically from a triangle in which we had relations between Turks, Armenians, and Kurds in the same territory, to a binary relationship. Now we have relationships between Kurds and Turks in Turkey. We have relations between Armenians and Turks globally, but obviously not across the countries. There are also relationships between Kurds and Armenians, of course, but that is a process that's fairly new, I think, and fairly old. Now these social boundaries, they have changed. And I think this is important to mention because the dyadic relationship in which we are now, they are more conflictuous. They are more zero-sum because you have no alliances, you have no mediating parties, and it's just the two of us. We basically have to do it together. That's one development. A second development in our relationships is that we went from hierarchical to horizontal relations. Or as we would say in the political sociology, we went from ranked ethnic relations to unranked ethnic relations. Now Turks, historically, as the powerful group, were superimposed on Armenians as Ottoman subjects. And we see some echoes of this sometimes, some reverberations. A lot of my Turkish friends, they keep saying that Armenians come up to them and address them in Turkish. And they ask the question, why? Is that to make us feel comfortable? Are people showing their skills? Or are people gathering intelligence? Because when the opposite happens, when Turks try to speak Armenian, and even when they learn it well, people get rather nervous. And I remember once myself, I was in an elevator. This is at a conference, and then two Armenians got into the elevator. They started talking in Armenian about me. And of course, so I had to say, oh, so that was rather uncomfortable. I think one example. I get similar complaints from my Armenian friends. So in their interpersonal encounters with Turks, they argue the Turks keep patronizing them. They talk about how similar we are, and how great relations used to be, and we were such great neighbors in Istanbul, we never had any problems with Armenians. And this is a kind of condescending, superficial attitude, a kind of imperial hangover. We don't really need to listen to the subjects, that kind of attitude. Now this is changing, and I think it also needs to change. This shift requires a mental change among both nations, so that we behave as two kind of normal horizontal nations, like when a Lithuanian person meets an Italian, for example, and not hierarchically as imperial overlord and subaltern. On the long term, I think this is important. We need to be able to criticize each other without being burdened by nationalism or the imperial shadow. So what I'm suggesting here is a kind of post-colonial, humble, egalitarian identity based on a realistic, just self-image. Call it a kind of decolonization of Turkish society. You can compare this maybe with the way that, for example, white people in the United States or in South Africa changed in their attitudes towards black people. Let me move on to the political boundaries. So there are two topics I want to talk about. One is about nationalism and the other one is about borders. We tend to think that there's a primacy of the political. And I just gave an interview in the hallway where almost all the questions were about President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And there's a kind of old cliche that we need to, leave politics to the politicians, just like the idea often in Turkey to leave the genocide to the historians. I think that's not working out too well. Both of this is not working out too well. We need top-down initiatives. We need the politicians. And I think also the politicians need us as civil society, as educators, as civil society workers. So this bottom-up process is absolutely needed as well. I see it as a pleasure to see so many papers deal with civil society initiatives between ordinary Armenians and ordinary Turks. And this is ultimately a problem of democracy and of transparency and of free institutions in both societies. We don't develop kind of democratic liberal institutions, then we cannot even set up the NGOs to go and reconcile with each other. And there too we see, unfortunately, some, obstacles. Because maybe some political boundaries, they don't change much. Now the past decades, let's say roughly from the 1970s on, 1980s, they have suggested a rather disappointing observation. As you know, Turkey was led by different governments. Here are just 3 parties on this slide that were influential in these different cabinets from the 1990s, 1980s to now. So we have the kind of Republicanist, Kemalist party, the CHP on the left. In the middle we have the nationalist or ultra-nationalist MHP. And on the right we have the, let's say, the moderate Islamist political party, the AKP. Now these groups, their constituencies and their politicians, they disagree profoundly on core values and on political issues. With one exception, the genocide. So the one consensus that these political parties or governments have had is that the genocide is not a priority, and none of them have really effectuated a major shift. There were some good shifts in policy until 2014. Remember, that was only 3 years ago when Erdogan offered his condolences to the Armenians. But there are no major breakthroughs. We don't see breakthroughs as in the end of the Soviet Union or the collapse of apartheid or, I don't know, the breakup of Czechoslovakia. So like major breakthroughs in this policy, unfortunately, we have not seen. So some of my more cynical colleagues have argued it doesn't really matter who runs Turkey. Maybe the problem is related to state interests, to raison d'etat. And it's not governments that is the problem. I find that a rather sad and bleak observation, but it's worth exploring whether a different conception of Turkishness is needed for recognition, reconciliation, and reparations. And I think that especially the failure of the AKP to really come to terms with the genocide demonstrates that the problem is related to the Turkish nationalism that needs to be, I think, fully and quite fundamentally deconstructed in its way it relates to the genocide. My final point is here about the borders. Now, I grew up in a small town called Enschede. This is on the Dutch-German border. And there used to be a hard border in this town. So it's right on the border, this town. My parents' house is 4 or 5 kilometers from the border. And this used to be the picture. So there used to be border checks and German police and Dutch police. You couldn't import everything you want. Gradually, the European Union abolished these borders. In 1995, with the Schengen Treaty, most of these conflict boundaries, they disappeared. Now people go shopping in Germany and in Holland. There's Erasmus students they exchange. The polarization has decreased. We learned each other's languages. It's quite important, I think. And look at the border now. This is the same border after 1995. So the only thing you notice is a slight change in the asphalt in the border. As you drive through, you don't even notice. And nowadays, I go hiking, I have a t-shirt on, I have shorts, some money, the same money as they have in Germany. I walk to Germany, I have a beer, I come back, nobody checks me with anything. Fantastic. One day, I went and I stopped right on the border. And I thought, wouldn't it be lovely if we could do the same thing in Turkey and Armenia? But unfortunately, the Turkish-Armenian border is a boundary of violence. It is inefficient, it stalls development, it keeps people apart, deprives people of opportunities, and it causes suffering. I see it as a political tool of punishment, indeed indirect violence, maybe even a form of siege. Now we could compare this border to Fortress Europe, the outside borders of the European Union. Because of the tight European borders, thousands of refugees, they die horrible deaths in the Mediterranean, drowning. We've seen this happening in the past couple of years. Now, this refugee crisis might not have easy solutions, but I think the Turkish-Armenian one seems obviously clear to me. The opening of the border and diplomatic relations does not mean an end to conflict. There are many examples of countries that have open borders, but no or bad diplomatic relations, such as Pakistan and India, such as Russia and China. And the best example for me is Serbia and Croatia. Remember, these are two countries that fought a bitter war 20 years ago. They really hate each other. They accuse each other of genocide all the time at the International Court of Justice. They have a border dispute, which I show you the map here. But still there's diplomacy and still there are open borders. So conflict is good. We should have lots of healthy conflict. But we need to transform this conflict, I think, with open borders. I want to close my talk with a dream. In December 1970, the German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, visited the memorial for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This was the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw that rose against the Nazis in 1944, and the Germans cracked down and they killed all the Jews in the ghetto, in the city. And Willy Brandt made an important visit, December 1970. He went to this memorial, and last minute, nobody expected it, he went on his knees out of respect and apology for the suffering that Germany had created. In the same visit, he accepted the German-Polish borders, which were disputed until 1970, and thereby normalized relations between Germany and Poland. I think this is absolutely iconic. And no surprise, the year after, Willy Brandt received the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, my hope is that one day, as Turks and Armenians, we will have a leader who will be as brave and apologetic as that. So we can have open borders, so also in Turkey we can have Jingalov huts. Thank you very much for your attention.